Hello and welcome once again to this week's Straight Bat, my weekly blog where, as the title suggests, I comment with a straight bat. All eyes this week were on the Bihar elections, a cliffhanger of an elections where margins were very narrow in the end as the NDA squeaked home over the MAHAGATHBANDHAN. The two sides got an almost identical vote share of 37% each. In fact, the NDA got just about 12,000 votes more overall than the MGB. That tight was this election. A few seats here and there, and the picture could have dramatically changed, which is why there have been plenty of postmortems. And among the factors that have been analyzed in these postmortems is the so-called OWAISI factor, the O factor in Bihar. And I think at the very outset, it's now important to settle whether Asaduddin Owaisi, the AIMIM MP from Hyderabad, cost the MAHAGATHBANDHAN the election. The answer is no, N-O. Let me explain. Asaduddin Owaisi contested 20 seats. These seats were contested in the Simanchal area, in the districts of Katiyar, Kishanganj, Araria, with large Muslim populations. In many areas, even more than 50% constituencies with Muslims. Mr. Owaisi won 5 seats out of the 20 he contested. 5. Remember, the MGB ended up with 110 and the NDA with 123. So a difference of 13. Mr. Owaisi won 5. Out of the remaining 15, in only one constituency is the margin of defeat of the RJD and Congress alliance less than the votes that Owaisi polled. So at best, you can say that Owaisi damaged, and I know he doesn't like that word as he told me in a TV interview. At best, Mr. Owaisi cost the RJD Congress 6 seats. The fact, therefore, is that we need to be conscious in not overhyping the Owaisi factor as being responsible for the MAHAGATHBANDHAN defeat. If anything, if you are to look at vote cutters or vote katuas in Bihar as they are called, Chirag Paswan was the real vote katua. There are 33 seats where Chirag Paswan polled more than the defeat suffered by the JDU. So it is actually the JDU which has reasons to complain that their tally could have been better but for Chirag Paswan. The MAHAGATHBANDHAN, I know, has been calling Owaisi the team B of the BJP. Let me tell you an interesting story. A few years ago, in fact in Bihar itself, we were having a conclave, a Bihar election conclave, and I asked this question to Mr. Owaisi, that is it true that you are batting in this election on behalf of Amit Shah, Narendra Modi and the BJP? He said, of course I am. Don't you remember I came to your house over lunch, Amit Shah and me struck a deal? You were there, you are a witness to it. He was obviously being sarcastic. Is there a deal between Mr. Owaisi and Amit Shah? Look, at the moment, no one has any evidence. The fact is, Asaduddin Owaisi, and let's be very clear here, is a politician who wants to expand beyond Hyderabad. The AIMIM was a party that was forged in a sense as a sort of Islamist force, cultural and political Islam focused around Hyderabad city. In the aftermath of partition, the role of the Razakars, the fraught history of the Nizam-ruled Hyderabad meant that the MIM in a sense became the voice of the Muslim population of the old city of Hyderabad. And that's how it stayed or has stayed for much of the last 7 decades. First, it was Asaduddin Owaisi's father who was MP for several years, and now Mr. Owaisi over the last 20 years has represented Hyderabad city. But at some stage, he decided that he wanted to expand. I still recall the first election where he seemed to strike roots outside Hyderabad was in Maharashtra, in a Nanded municipal election, when he won 11 out of 81 seats for the first time. And then you looked at OWAISI and said, can he make a dent beyond Hyderabad? Over the years, what we've seen is Mr. OWAISI has now targeted specific regions, not even a state, he targets specific regions. So in Maharashtra, for example, the AIMIM has grown in Marathwada, which is the old Nizam state. They now have an MP in Aurangabad. But let's be clear, the MP in Aurangabad, Imtiaz Jalil, a former journalist colleague of mine at NDTV, won that election not because of the performance of the MIM as much as the fact that there was an independent candidate who actually polled a large number of votes, and that breakup or the fragmentation that took place enabled Imtiaz to win the election in Aurangabad. In 2019, when the Maharashtra elections were held, Mr. OWAISI and his party won seats in Malegaon and in Dhule, again in constituencies with 40% plus Muslim population. In fact, that is the number that I now use to describe the OWAISI factor. That wherever Muslims are more than 40% and Mr. OWAISI puts up a candidate, there is a possibility that if there is a Muslim consolidation and a fragmentation on the other side of the non-Muslim vote, Asaduddin OWAISI is competitive. And that's exactly what's happened in Simanchal. I remember in 2015 when Mr. OWAISI first went into Simanchal, I met him in Kishanganj. He was staying in a hotel, virtually had taken it over in a way, and was campaigning aggressively. He was campaigning in a sense to challenge the Congress, RJD, JDU alliance at the time and say that, look, I also in a way represent the Muslim community. And I think the difference is that Mr. OWAISI says it in an unapologetic manner. He claims openly, yes, I am a representative of Muslim interests. I want Muslims to get a better deal. I want Muslims to be empowered. Now that vocabulary is no longer used by the so-called secular parties in the country. Why? Because these secular parties have taken their Muslim vote for granted and are at the same time afraid that if they espouse Muslim causes in any way, they will lose the Hindu vote. The real story of India, particularly after the rise of the BJP in the last decade, is the battle is for the Hindu vote. Just look at the number of Muslim MPs in parliament. They are steadily declining Lok Sabha election after Lok Sabha election. Why? Because in many areas, the so-called secular parties are also playing their own Hindu vote bank politics. They are competing in a way with the BJP for the Hindu vote. And when it comes to the Muslim vote, these same secular parties have reached out to clerics like Shahi Imam, if you remember gloriously all those years ago, ingloriously, who suddenly saw himself as a spokesperson of the Muslim community. And political parties would line up outside the Jama Masjid. Now, if you treat the Muslims as a captive vote bank, while attempting to compete for the Hindu vote bank with the BJP, which again unapologetically is reaching out to the Hindu vote, the secular parties are caught in the middle. So you have OWAISI on one side, who claims to unapologetically espouse the Muslim cause, and you have the BJP, which plays its brand of majoritarian politics. Mr. OWAISI therefore takes advantage of that. And particularly in areas like Simanchal, well, let's be clear. If you ever go to Simanchal, it's an area where you can clearly see high levels of poverty, low incomes, and a large youth Muslim underclass. For decades, these areas have not got their due. Political parties, the so-called secular parties, have claimed we will lift the Muslims from their poor income conditions. but have not done so. Enter Asaduddin Owaisi, who tells that same vote, look, I will represent your interests. And I think somewhere he has struck a chord. And that's a warning signal to the so-called secular parties. Today it is Simanchal in Bihar, tomorrow it could be Uttar Pradesh, and more importantly next year it could be Bengal. Because remember, in Bengal there are more than 100 such constituencies where the Muslim vote is critical. Mamata Banerjee has relied on that 27% Muslim vote bank in her political calculations. Mr. Owaisi has made it very clear, I am entering Bengal. Then again we will discuss the O factor, but whenever we discuss the O factor, we also need to discuss the failure of the so-called secular parties to lift the Muslims and provide them equal opportunities. The rise of Owaisi is symbolic of the failure of the so-called secular parties, along with the rise of majoritarian politics of the BJP. Keep an eye then on Asaduddin Owaisi. He will be a factor in elections wherever there is a substantial Muslim population. Thanks for watching. This is The Straight Bat. Happy Diwali.